Well, I was saying that I'll start with a couple of general comments on the topic, and then we can throw it open to discussion. It's quite usual these days to draw up analogies between South Africa and Israel. Most of them, I think, are questionable at best. But there's one that isn't discussed much, if at all, that is actually quite valid, I think, one analogy. Now, that has to do with the topic, with the matter of what's nowadays called legitimation and delegitimation. That was an issue for South Africa for about the last 40 years of the white nationalist regime. Back in 1958, the South African foreign minister called in the U.S. ambassador to talk to him and said, we know that we're becoming a kind of an international pariah. Everyone's voting against us in the United Nations. We're right, but they don't understand it. But it doesn't really matter, because you and I both understand that there's only one vote at the United Nations, namely yours. And as long as you, the United States, back us up, we don't really care what the world thinks. And so matters, in fact, proceeded through by the 1970s, the United Nations did declare an arms embargo on South Africa. South Africa, by that point, was reacted by becoming extremely aggressive and contemptuous towards the international community, and in fact, even the United States. President Carter at that time. So, for example, when President Carter and a group of international diplomats were about to present a plan for a South African withdrawal from Namibia, a UN protectorate which they were occupying, sending in a population and so on, in violation of UN orders. Just at that point, South Africa attacked a refugee camp in Angola, Kasinga refugee camp, killing 800 people, causing international outcry, but they basically didn't care. Well, fortunately for them, Ronald Reagan came along, and he strongly supported the apartheid regime and continued to support it right through the 1980s. That included its aggression and violence in neighboring countries, which was quite lethal, killing over 1 million people, plus what was going on within South Africa. But the U.S. supported it. In fact, U.S. trade with South Africa increased. That was in violation even of congressional sanctions by that time. And the justification for it was the War on Terror. Now, the War on Terror was not declared by George W. Bush, contrary to what's claimed. He redeclared it. It was declared by Ronald Reagan when he came into office in 1981, announcing that international terrorism, plague of the modern age, would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy. So in the case of South Africa, the justification was you had to defend the white nationalist regime against the terrorism of the African National Congress. In fact, in 1988, the U.S. designated, this is Mandela's ANC, he was of course in prison, the U.S. designated the ANC as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. In fact, Mandela was just taken off the terrorist list about 2 years ago. He can now come to the United States without a special dispensation. Then the U.S. policy changed. Around 1989, 1990, the U.S. policy shifted, and within 2 or 3 years, the white nationalist regime had collapsed and apartheid was over. This is not the only time that's happened. Incidentally, that was not the only factor. Another major factor was Cuba. Cuba, which had played an enormous role in the liberation of black Africa. It's sort of well known by now to scholarship, but not to the general public. They essentially drove South Africans out of Namibia, and as they had driven them out of Angola, and that was a big factor. But the main change was just that the U.S. policy shifted. And exactly as the South African foreign minister had said 40 years earlier, when the U.S. changed policy, the regime collapsed. As I say, there are other cases. Well, the problem for South Africa was its delegitimation in the international community, sustained by U.S. support, so it didn't matter until U.S. support was withdrawn, and the legitimation of its main enemy, the African National Congress, which by the late 80s had enormous international support. Mandela was kind of a secular saint by now. Those of you who follow Israeli affairs know that that's pretty much what they're discussing now with great concern. There's concern that the country is being delegitimated in the international arena. And at the same time, it's the Palestinians are being legitimated. It's a situation, and they have one supporter, the United States, alone. In fact, that has gone on for a long time. You probably know that a couple of months ago in February, there was a Security Council resolution calling on Israel to pursue what in fact is official U.S. policy, namely to stop settlement expansion. It was vetoed by the United States alone. That aroused some attention, but it really shouldn't have, because the U.S. had been vetoing resolutions condemning Israel's actions for a long time. The first one was in January 1976, 35 years ago, when the major Arab states brought to the Security Council a resolution calling for a two-state settlement, Israel and a Palestinian state, on the international border, so-called Green Line, and then it took up the wording of UN 242, which everyone recognizes to be the main diplomatic instrument. So there would have to be added guarantees for the security of every state in the region and its right to exist within secure and recognized borders. That's 1976. The U.S. vetoed it again in 1980. I won't run through the rest of the record, but until the present, that's been the pattern. Things moved out of the Security Council because I was excluded by the U.S. veto, but the General Assembly almost every year had regular votes, 150 to 2 or something like that, and that continues up to the present. Well, this is continuing. There'll be another important vote, very likely, in the coming session of the General Assembly starting next September as a winter meeting. What's coming up then is recognition of Palestinian statehood. By now, well over 100 countries recognize Palestine. That's about something like 80 to 90% of the world's population. In contrast, Kosovo, which is now accepted as in the United Nations, is supported by a tiny fraction of that. But the crucial difference is the U.S. does not join the 80 to 90% recognizing Palestine, and the U.S. does recognize Kosovo. So that's basically the South African minister's insight into how world affairs works, and he's correct. But anyway, this is going to come up, it's very likely going to come up in September, and it'll pose another dilemma for the United States. Will it stand virtually alone in the international system in blocking the kind of settlement for which there is simply an overwhelming international consensus? Hard to find anything like this in world affairs. But for years, there's been an overwhelming agreement on approximately the January 1976 Security Council proposal that the U.S. vetoed. By now it includes essentially everybody, at least formally, all the non-aligned countries, Europe, Latin America, the Arab League, which has an even more forthcoming proposal, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, in fact, essentially everyone. The only holdouts are the United States and Israel, and the South African minister's principle still applies. There's only one vote, that's the United States. It's the consequence of having overwhelming power. So the world can say what it wants, but if the United States objects, nobody can do anything about it. Well, that's the, and that of course shapes commentary and discussion and so on, at least in the United States, to some extent elsewhere, lesser extent. Well, that's basically the situation, and it's as far as Israel's delegitimation is concerned, they're getting much more concerned. So, for example, Human Rights Watch, which is a very conservative organization, they don't take strong positions on policy. They recently came out with a declaration, which I don't think was even reported here, at least I didn't see it, which called on the United States to terminate aid to Israel, any aid to Israel, up to the level of what Israel spends in the occupied territories. Because, as they point out correctly, all of that is in violation of international law. They also call on the United States government to investigate foundations, organizations, others in the United States, which have a tax-free status and are giving aid to anything in Israel that involves discrimination and repression. So that would include everything in the occupied territories plus more. That cuts quite a wide swath if you look at it. They also called upon Europe, and of course the United States as well, to boycott goods from the settlements and to refuse in any way to participate in activities in supporting Israeli activities in the occupied territories, all of which are illegal. I mean, that's not been in question for years. It was actually was recognized by the government of Israel back in 1967. Any transfer of population into the occupied territories is in violation of the Geneva Conventions, core of international humanitarian law. As I say, that was recognized by Israel's top legal authorities back in 1967, including the Attorney General, including the official in charge of the occupied territories, General Moshe Dayan, who simply pointed out, sure, it's illegal, but states violate international law. And so we will too. And they can, as long as the big boys in Washington support them, basically the South African principle. And so it continues to the present. Most recently, the February 2011 Security Council resolution of which the core was supporting official U.S. policy, that is, calling for an end to settlement expansion. But the U.S. vetoed it in accord with the traditional pattern. We'll see what happens this September, but it could be quite significant. Amnesty International, which also very rarely takes strong positions on policy issues, had already called for an arms embargo on Israel directed to the United States, because this is the time of the Gaza invasion, because Israel was using the arms in violation of international law. They could have but didn't add that the arms that the United States is sending to Israel are also used in violation of U.S. domestic law, which conditions arms transfers on, or very specifically, on particular uses only, defense and internal security. And of course, anything, the Gaza war was obviously not that, and nor any of Israel's actions in the occupied territories. Well, Israel's reacting to all of this in pretty much the way South Africa did. A lot of hysteria, a lot of anger, circling the wagons, and carrying out actions, very brutal and arrogant actions, which are it's almost as if they're being carried out in purposeful defiance and contempt of international opinion, like the Gaza attack, or the attack on the flotilla last May, in which Israeli commandos landed on a ship in international waters that was trying to bring humanitarian aid to Gaza, and it killed 9 people, including an American citizen, which both of those actions caused an international furor. But again, the one vote that matters didn't go along with international opinion, so they think they can get away with it. And in fact, if you read the Israeli press, they're quite surprised that there is any international reaction, because they're so obviously right in everything they do, just like South Africa. Since they're obviously right, it must be that the world is therefore wrong, and there has to be some explanation, anti-Semitism or whatever it might be. And the internal reactions in Israel are kind of like South Africa too, imposing pretty harsh legislation, some of it so pretty extreme, so much so that the head of the Israeli Bar Association, Shlomo Cohen, a pretty conservative figure, recently had an article lamenting what he called Israel's drift to fascism. It's a pretty strong word, and he ran through the legislation that brought that led him to that conclusion. Well, these are, it's not unfamiliar. In many respects, it is reliving the pattern of South Africa, particularly the reaction to the delegitimation that they perceived in the sanctions movement, the boycotts, other protests, and correspondingly the legitimation of their enemy, which will come to a head just in just a few months in the case of Israel-Palestine, which will be a sensitive and interesting moment. Well, what are the options given these circumstances? One option is that the U.S. and will shift policy, as it did in the case of South Africa, and decide to join the world. That is, to join into the long-standing and quite overwhelming international consensus and accept a two-state settlement. The general form of that settlement is pretty well known. I mean, you can argue about details, but the basic guidelines are quite clear. And in fact, it actually came quite close to realization once. There hasn't been 1 month in the last 35 years when a U.S. president was willing to tolerate a settlement in terms of the international consensus. That was Bill Clinton's last month in office, January 2001. Clinton, there had been negotiations in the summer before at Camp David, and they broke down. And Clinton recognized that the position that the U.S. and Israel had proposed there could not be accepted by any Palestinians, no matter how moderate. So in December of 2000, Clinton proposed what he called his parameters, the general guidelines for settlement, which were somewhat vague but more forthcoming. He then made a speech in which he said that Both sides had accepted the parameters. Both sides had reservations. The two sides, Israel-Palestine, met in Taba, Egypt in January 2001. We happen to have a very detailed record of that, of those negotiations. There was international observers, detailed Israeli sources, and so on. And they came pretty close to a settlement, close enough so that in their last press conference, jointly the group said that if they had a little more time, they could have settled everything, all the details. Well, Israel called off the negotiations prematurely, and it didn't continue. There were informal, high-level negotiations that did continue, came out with proposals. One, the best-known one, is called the Geneva Accords, was presented in Geneva in December 2003 by the two sides. It was welcomed by the world. The Europeans sent envoys and so on. Israel rejected it. The U.S. refused even to comment on it, barely mentioned here in the press. But that was an extremely detailed proposal. You can think it was right or wrong, you can argue about it, but the facts are it was very close to the international consensus that has been accepted for a long time, and that happens to be exactly in accord with international law. It's been reiterated over and over, most recently even authoritatively by the International Court of Justice, with the U.S. Justice agreeing in a separate declaration a couple of years ago, 2004. Well, that's one option. One possibility is that the U.S. will make the same kind of move that it finally made in the case of South Africa, and then would come the task of implementing it, but it's really not a big problem. Once the U.S. agrees, it can be done. That's one option. Now, most of the discussion of this topic assumes that there's a choice between two options. One, the one I just described, and another, that Israel takes over the whole territory, and then the Palestinians carry out a civil rights struggle internal to the now unified Israel-Palestine, an anti-apartheid struggle. So that's considered the other option. You look at most of the debate about the topic, that's what it is. Israel, in Israel, it's objected that this would create what they call a demographic problem, meaning too many non-Jews in a Jewish state, so that'll be a problem. But many Palestinians are supporting it. They say this is the way to go. A two-state settlement is out, so we'll have a one-state settlement in which we'll have an anti-apartheid struggle. There's only one problem with this. This discussion, it's omitting the third option, the realistic option. Israel will never agree to this, nor is there any reason to expect them to. What they'll do is the third option, namely continue doing exactly what they're doing. And if they have U.S. support, they can continue to do it. And we know what that is because it's happening under our eyes. It's been going on for years. Since the early 90s, the U.S. and Israel, and just about everything Israel does, should be called U.S.-Israel because they work in tandem. And Israel cannot go beyond what the U.S. will support and permit it to do. So there's the U.S. and Israel since the early 90s have been committed to separating Gaza from the West Bank in strict violation of the Oslo agreements, which declare them to be a territorial unity. It's been done in many ways, closures and so on and so forth. By now they're pretty separate. So if a person in Gaza, say a young person in Gaza wants to study in West Bank University, can't do it. If somebody in Gaza needs medical attention that they can get in a Jerusalem hospital, can't go. If somebody wants to see their family, not very many miles away, they can't do it. So by now they're pretty well split. That's one element. The second, with regard to the West Bank, is to take over Israel. The U.S. and Israel want to take over essentially what's valuable in the West Bank and to let the rest kind of rot. And we know exactly what it is because you can see it happening. And in fact, the plans have been developing step by step over the past 20 years. And sometimes it's called the Sharon Plan, sometimes something else, but it's always essentially the same. Israel takes over everything that's inside what's called the separation wall. It's actually an annexation wall. It's a wall which snakes through the West Bank, leaves on the Israeli side arable land, major water resources, the pleasant suburbs of the major cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, takes over the Jordan Valley, which essentially imprisons the rest, and then cuts corridors through the remaining area, one east of Jerusalem, and I should say Jerusalem is now about 5 times the size of what it was in 1967, annexed illegally in violation of Security Council orders. So it's a huge Greater Jerusalem, then corridor extending to the east, which pretty much bisects the West Bank. That's what it was built for. And 2 other corridors in the north, which separate the rest. And what's left amounts to roughly 50% of the West Bank, and 42% at the moment. Probably will expand. The rest, if Israel just takes that over, there's no demographic problem, because that region is kept free of Arabs, virtually. I mean, there's a couple of scattered Arab settlements, but essentially free of Arabs. So no demographic problem. Israel gets the valuable territory, the valuable land, whatever it likes, and the Palestinians are left in unviable cantons, pretty much separated from one another. That's the option. That's the alternative to having a 2-state settlement. Now, notice I say settlement, not solution. I don't think a 2-state settlement is or should be the end of the road. It could lay the basis for what seem to me better settlements, but you have to get there in stages. You can't just, say I want the world to be the way I want the world to be the way I like it. That doesn't work. You have to show how you get there, and there are possible ways to get there, but I have heard nothing that has any option but this one. So those are the realistic options. They depend crucially on the U.S. position. Will the U.S. join the world on this issue, or won't it? As I say, this goes far back. It goes back to the 1970s. There are many factors that keep the United States separate from world opinion, just as there were in the case of South Africa, many other issues. But we might as well face the reality. That's the structure of world order. The United States is an outlier, and it's so powerful that it gets its way, but it gets its way in violation of global opinion on many, many issues. That relates, I'll just say one word about this, to another major phenomenon that you're all familiar with, major events that have been taking place in the past few months, the so-called Arab Spring, the democracy uprisings in the Arab world. Now, these didn't come out of nowhere. The background is not discussed much, but it's pretty easy to find out. So take, say, Egypt, the most important country, the biggest, most significant, and so on. The uprising, the January 25th movement, was led by a group of, initiated by a group of fairly young, kind of tech-savvy professionals, pretty much, who called themselves the April 6th movement. Well, why April 6th? Because on April 6th, 2008, there was a major labor action organized by what has been quite a militant labor movement at the Mahala textile conglomerate, one of the biggest industrial conglomerates in Egypt. They were going to have a labor action calling for minimally decent working conditions, wages, and so on. And along with it were to be solidarity actions in the cities. Well, that was crushed by force, crushed by the U.S.-backed dictator, Mubarak. So therefore we don't know about it, but they know about it. The victims tend to have memories. And that was reflected when the popular movement burst out again a few months ago, led by the April 6th movement. The same is true in Tunisia and the other places where things are happening. In any event, in the past couple of months, it's been quite spectacular. There have been major developments in the Arab world. There are moves towards, there are efforts to try to construct some kind of, to overthrow the brutal, repressive regimes and to bring about some sort of a degree of freedom and democracy. And if you look closely, you'll find that the U.S. is pretty isolated on this, to an extent along with Western Europe. There happens to be a very good reason why the United States and its allies cannot tolerate a democracy in the Arab countries. A very simple reason. Do you want to figure out why? Just take a look at the polls of Arab public opinion. Now, they don't get reported in the press here, but they're known, and surely planners known. The polls are taken by the most prestigious U.S. polling organizations. They're released by major institutions, Brookings Institution, and so on. So they're perfectly public, and certainly in the eyes of planners are thinking about them. And what do you find when you look at them? Well, say, take Egypt, again, the most important country. In Egypt, 90% of the public thinks the worst threat they face is the United States and Israel, which they don't distinguish much from the United States, rightly. About 80% think the region would be better off and more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. A small percentage, roughly 10% in the region, think that Iran is a threat. These figures extend, a little variation over almost the entire region. Well, if you have anything like a functioning democracy, then public opinion is going to be reflected in policy. That's what a democracy is supposed to be. So the idea that there could be a democratic uprising in the Arab world is just a nightmare for Western planners. And they will do whatever they can to prevent it. And if you look closely, that's pretty much what's happening. Well, it's also a nightmare for Israel. Israel has relied on the Arab dictators to suppress their populations and to enter into arrangements with it. And if public opinion manifests itself in policy, that's going to be a huge problem, and they know it. That's why they're so strongly opposed to the democratic uprisings. And the same is true here, though it's not put that way. Well, that's going to have an effect too. So far the uprisings have been fairly well controlled. They've changed the names, but not really the regimes. So say in Egypt, the military still runs the show, but that probably, you can't keep the lid on that forever. This has been going on for a long time. We don't read about it, but certainly planners know it. So again, go back about 50 years, and President Eisenhower, late 50s, was discussed in internal discussions. It's been declassified for years, so it's public. He discussed with his staff what he called a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, and not from the governments. They're more or less okay, but from the people. And right at that time, the National Security Council, which is the main planning body, came out with a memorandum discussing the Arab world, and they explained it. They said there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and brutal dictators and prevents democracy and development, and that we do this because we want to make sure we can maintain control over their energy resources. And it went on to say that the perception is more or less accurate, and furthermore, that's pretty much what we should be doing. And so it continues right to the present. But again, chances you can keep the lid on this forever are not very high. And so the explosion might get out of control, and that is certain to influence other developments in the region in quite unpredictable ways. Well, I'll stop with this. Just mention that the crucial issue that we should bear in mind, I think, is that contrary to almost all media and other commentary on this matter, the framework is not one in which, say, in Israel-Palestine, the United States is an honest broker trying to bring about negotiations between two recalcitrant, difficult parties, Israel and the Palestinians. That's simply not true. If there were serious negotiations going on, they would be run by some authentically neutral party, and the US and Israel would be on one side, and the rest of the world would be on the other side. And that's the way they would have been going on for 35 years. Well, until we realize that, and until we do something about it, this region is going to continue to face extremely dangerous times and very explosive ones, which may blow up all over the world. I'll stop there.
The Arab League is calling the UN for a no-fly zone over Gaza as a resolution.
A no-fly zone?
Over Gaza? Will Israel accept this resolution, or will it just continue what it's doing?
There can't be a no-fly zone over Gaza because the ruler of the world doesn't permit it. Okay? Just like there's no interference when the U.S. invades Iraq. I mean, look, that's the way the world works. It doesn't work the way you're taught in civics classes. Now, the world is ruled by force, not by law. And force happens to be overwhelmingly in one place, not entirely, of course. And so there can be, if the U.S. is participating in an invasion, as it was in the case of Gaza, the Gaza invasion is a U.S.-Israeli invasion. That's why Amnesty International called for an embargo. It's American arms they're using, American diplomatic support, and so on. So if the U.S. is participating in an act of aggression, no, you can't have any interference. So sure they won't. It won't even get to the point where it could be considered. I mean, that doesn't have to happen. These things happen because the American population permits it. We're the only ones who can stop it.
What percentage of military spending throughout the world is spent here in the United States?
It's close to 50%, a little below 50%. Of course, that depends somewhat on how you count it. So if you count the spending for past wars, for veterans, for interest on the debt, and so on, then it goes up even beyond that. But the standard calculations, U.S. military spending is close to 50% of global spending. And of course, it's quite totally different in character. So this is far more advanced in technological development and means of destruction. You could see that in Libya. I mean, the United States was kind of reluctant to get involved in Libya. France and Britain were in the forefront, but they couldn't even impose a no-fly zone without calling on the United States to do the heavy lifting. In the first couple of days, it was all U.S. Tomahawks and Warthogs and so on. The U.S. is so far ahead of the rest of the world in military expenditures that it's laughable. Like the Pentagon comes out with statements warning about, say, the Chinese military buildup, the next biggest power in the world. Well, it turns out, according to the Pentagon calculations, this is by memory, I may not have it exact, that the Chinese military budget is roughly, I think they said, a fifth of what the United States spends in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is a fraction of the military budget. And in fact, it's actually less than the U.S. military spends on research and development. I think that was their conclusion. Also, it's not just advanced technology, advanced killing techniques, and so on. It's many other things. I mean, is there any other country in the world that has 800 military bases all over the world where the troops are and the supplies and so on are ready for use and are used? It's unique. Also, the U.S., despite what we're doing to our own country, I mean, the country is being internally crushed in most astonishing ways. But despite that, it's still the richest country in the world with enormous advantages. That may not be true for long if current policies continue here, domestic policies.
So you spoke about the three options for how things could proceed. So theoretically, if America did change its policy in Israel, how would that affect the broader public opinion in the Arab world?
If the United States changed policy?
Yeah.
Well, one of the real irritants to Arab public opinion is U.S. support for Israel. It's not the only one. I think the National Security Council was basically correct back in the 50s and since that the main issue is that the United States supports harsh, brutal dictatorships, blocks democracy and development, and does so because that's the best way to keep control of their energy supplies. That's been the major issue. There are others, like for example, there are they're not regular, but there often are public opinion studies. And so, for example, there was an interesting one right after 9/11. The Wall Street Journal, to its credit, did a study of public opinion in the Arab world about attitudes toward the United States. They just kept to the kind of people they were interested in. Bankers, professionals, what they called moneyed Muslims. They didn't care about what's called the Arab street, just the rich guys, the guys who were all involved in the U.S. Western international development programs and so on, the neoliberal programs. So they just did a study among them. Well, it turned out to be very much like the conclusions in 1958. Strong opposition to the United States because of its support of harsh dictatorships, its blocking democracy and development, and efforts to just control the energy system. They had other concerns by then. One concern was support for Israeli occupation and repression. The other concern, which strikingly never really hit the radar in the United States, but it did over the Arab world, was the Iraq sanctions. The Clinton sanctions on Iraq, may have killed hundreds of thousands of people, maybe a million. They strengthened the dictatorship. They crushed the population, and they probably prevented Saddam Hussein from going the way of other dictators that the U.S. was supporting by internal revolt. And there was enormous bitterness about that over the whole Arab world. These are major crimes. So there are specific ones, but I think the basic one remains what the National Security Council said. Actually, that's responsible for the fact that the United States and Britain, incidentally, also have fairly consistently supported radical Islamism in opposition to secular nationalism. You can see it right now. The main ally of the United States in the region is Saudi Arabia, which is the most extreme radical Islamic state anywhere. Also the main supporter of jihadism and funder of jihadism and the ideological center of it. Now that's been the main beneficiary of U.S. and British support for a long time, because it's the right kind of dictatorship. It keeps the population under control. For example, there was an effort in Saudi Arabia to have a day of protest, the Friday day of protest, like everywhere else.